Alien beast woman cult priestess says I'm the chosen mate of her god, then offers herself. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The shuttle's warning systems had already failed by the time Christopher broke through Nithra 9 upper atmosphere, sparks dancing across the controls like fireflies trapped in a bottle. The planet's thick mist obscured nearly everything below, and the emergency stabilizers kicked in too late. All he could do was guide the vessel toward the faintest glimmer of terrain through the fog. He braced for impact. The crash wasn't catastrophic, but it was bad enough to buckle the forward struts and trap him inside for several claustrophobic minutes. When he finally kicked his way out of the bent hatch, coughing from the smoke and stumbling over jagged shards of metal, he wasn't thinking about temples or gods. He was just trying to survive. Christopher was an exobiologist, not a soldier. He didn't believe in fate, prophecy, or the divine. He believed in field samples, soil acidity, and mineral layers, things that made sense. So when he spotted the silhouette of a spiraling stone structure rising out of the swirling plasma mist like some monolithic ribcage, he didn't think temple. He thought shelter. With his suit torn and no comms, he made his way toward the structure, limping slightly, jaw clenched, hand wrapped around a flare gun just in case the local wildlife took offense. The entrance stood open, a mouth of dark stone with glyphs etched in molten lines that shimmered faintly in the low light. The air inside was thick with incense and warmth, strangely breathable and heavy with something fragrant, spice, maybe, or some kind of musk. Inside, the sound changed. It wasn't just his boots against stone anymore. There were voices, low, melodic, and layered like chanting. The mist thickened as he stepped into the sanctum, and the temperature rose enough for sweat to bead at his brow. Then he saw them. A dozen alien figures knelt in a wide circle, heads bowed toward the center of a ritual dais ringed with flickering plasma altars. Their bodies were wrapped in translucent drapes, shimmering slightly as they moved in rhythm. Their fur gleamed like oil beneath the temple glow, each motion graceful and otherworldly. At the center stood one, unlike the others, taller, framed by horns ridged in gold bands, her tail swaying behind her with a fiery orb at the tip that left trails of light with every motion. She was staring directly at him. Christopher froze, his instincts screaming to backpedal, but her gaze held him locked in place. She didn't look angry or surprised. She looked expectant, like she had known he'd appear. Then she spoke, her voice a low musical current that echoed off the stone walls and made the hair on his neck rise. "He bears the scent," she said, loud enough for all to hear. The chanting stopped instantly. Christopher raised both hands in the universal sign for not a threat. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just a surveyor. Ship crashed. I'm not here to." She walked toward him and the worshippers bowed deeper, heads to the floor. Her expression was unreadable, intense. Her fur shimmered with colors that shifted subtly with each step, opal glints catching the temple light. The golden veil she wore fluttered as she moved, her ritual robes barely hiding the outline of a powerful yet elegant frame. She stopped just a foot away from him, inhaled and smiled with quiet reverence. "You carry the scent of fire and void. It is written, you are the divine mate." "I am not anyone's divine anything," Christopher muttered under his breath, already stepping back. But she was faster, not aggressive fluid, like wind curling around a flame. In one motion she drew back her veil, letting it fall behind her shoulders, and then dropped the upper folds of her ritual drapes. They slid down her shoulders and pulled around her waist like a wave of stardust and silk, revealing skin beneath the fur, soft, glowing faintly with iridescent hues, where veins of bioluminescence traced her collarbone. Every breath in the chamber seemed to stop. Christopher turned away instinctively. Okay, what the hell is this?" "You've arrived at the time of lunar alignment," she said. "You fulfill the scent, the firewalk pattern, and the vision. The rites demand we begin the binding." "Yeah, well, I demand an exit," he snapped. still facing away, one hand shielding his eyes even though curiosity itched in the back of his skull. "You cannot leave until the mist allows," she said calmly, "and the mist obeys only the divine's will." He turned back slightly, risking a glance, and, "Let me guess, that's me now." Her lips curled into a smile, not mocking, not smug, just warm. "Yes." His heart thudded against his ribs, not because she was naked, not just because this was mad, but because deep down some part of him believed her, not in a literal God sense, but something in this place responded to him. The altars had flickered when he stepped close. The chant had ended the moment he appeared, and her scent, strange, electric, ancient, clung to him now as if it recognized him. "I don't want to be worshipped," he said, quieter now. "You are not," she replied. "You are wanted, and the difference is sacred." Christopher stared at her, trying to process it all. A dozen questions vied for attention, but none had obvious answers. The exit wasn't visible anymore. The mists outside the temple pulsed like a living heartbeat, and here he was, unarmed, exhausted, and being told by a towering alien beast-woman priestess that he was the chosen mate of her people's god. And somehow, the craziest part wasn't that it had happened. The craziest part was that a small, stupid part of him wasn't running, not yet. The chamber had shifted. Christopher felt it not just in the air, but in the way the walls seemed to pulse subtly, as if reacting to the moment's tension. The priestess, this Mona, had resumed her full ritual garb, but the memory of her bold unveiling clung to him like static, impossible to brush off. He tried to speak again to steer the conversation back to logic, to sanity, but Mona moved first. She didn't shout or posture. She simply turned toward the gathered worshippers and made a low gesture with her open palm. The kneeling beast woman began to hum in unison again, a low chant that filled the space like the hum of a deep engine. The mist coiled upward in response, becoming almost fluid. Christopher backed away instinctively. "Listen, I just need a line to call my people, a shuttle, a beacon. I'm not interested in playing God or prophet or whatever this is." Mona didn't follow. Instead, she turned slightly, walking toward a raised dais at the center of the temple's spiral. She looked over her shoulder, the golden threads in her veil catching the light. "If the mists have drawn you here, then your way out is sealed. They respond to the will of the divine flame, and only when the flame is satisfied may one leave. That is what is written." "That's not how mist works," he muttered, though the scientist in him had already clocked the bizarre behavior of the atmosphere since he arrived. The fog outside wasn't consistent with any known gas. Its temperature, thickness, the fact that it seemed to pulse. It defied what should have been possible. Even now, the air shimmered faintly like something between humidity and plasma. "I need to know what this place is," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "This is the temple of the divine binding," Mona replied, as if it were obvious. "Built atop the convergence point of the fire lines beneath the moon, a sacred geometry that channels heat, mist, and memory. You stand where our God last touched the world." He crossed his arms. "You're telling me your God just showed up one day and said, 'Build a shrine here. I'll be back eventually, and by the way, it'll be a human.'" He tilted her head, her horns framing her face in a way that felt both elegant and intimidating. "We do not claim to understand the God's will. We only know the prophecies, the signs passed down over cycles. They describe a being from the stars carrying fire in his scent and a strange mind that walks with logic, yet carries the seed of transformation. You arrived in fire, carry logic, and have disrupted our rites simply by stepping into this space." The altars responded. "The flame recognized you." "I'm a biologist," he said bluntly. "I don't have a flame." She gave a soft, almost amused smile. "Perhaps not yet." He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped. The energy here wasn't hostile. That surprised him. The others weren't restraining him or forcing him to act. There was reverence, sure, but no malice. They genuinely believed he belonged here, believed he was important. It was unsettling in a different way. He'd been the guy behind scanners and charts his entire life, not the subject of belief. Mona stepped down from the dais, gliding over to a wall etched with symbols glowing softly. She touched one, and a door-shaped segment of stone slid open with a hiss. Warm mist poured out from a corridor behind it. She looked at him, then nodded once. "You require answers. Come." Against his better judgment, Christopher followed. He told himself it was for information, understanding, a way to find the exit or at least get a message out. But part of him couldn't ignore the sensation curling in his gut, the sense that something was pulling him forward, not just her voice. The corridor wound downward in slow spirals, deeper into the structure. The deeper they went, the warmer the air grew. Strange bioluminescent vines clung to the ceiling, pools in gently like heartbeats. Finally, they reached a chamber lit by a soft red glow with a crystal pool at its center. The walls were covered in carvings, images of humans standing beside beast women, some in poses of union, others of war, and a few of loss. "This is the archive of the bound," she said, stepping close to the wall and trailing her clawed fingers across an etching of two figures holding hands. "The gods chosen were always few, rare. Sometimes they came from beyond, sometimes born among us, but they were always different." He stepped closer to one of the carving's eyes, narrowing. One of the figures didn't just look human. It was human, fully, not stylized or symbolic. His suit scanner verified the pigment was less than a century old. "This can't be ancient. That figure, it looks just like—" "Like you?" Mona asked quietly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The realization hung in the air between them. Whoever this was, they weren't part of some forgotten myth. They were real, recent, possibly another crash survivor, possibly someone who had played along with this religion and vanished without explanation. He looked at her then, searching her expression for deceit, but she wasn't lying. If anything, she looked afraid of what this might mean for her beliefs. "I don't want power," he said finally. "I didn't ask for this." "No one ever does," she said. "But you must decide what to do with it." Silence lingered. The mist around the pool stirred faintly, and in the red glow her fur shimmered like living fire. He should have been making a plan to escape, but instead he found himself watching her more closely, not because she was exotic or strange, but because she wasn't begging him to believe anything. She simply existed, calm, composed, deeply spiritual, yet visibly shaken by this twist in her reality. They weren't that different in a strange way. Finally, she gestured to a side alcove, modest, bedded with soft moss and lit with a low flame. "You should rest. The temple will not let you leave yet. When you wake, we will speak again, not as priestess and god, but as two beings thrown into something neither of us asked for." Christopher hesitated, then stepped toward the alcove. As he sat down, still guarded but less defensive, he looked at her again. "Mona, if you're wrong, if I'm not what you think I am." She nodded slowly. "Then I will still have met the one who reminded me to question." And with that, she turned and walked back into the spiraling corridor, her tail's glowing flame fatting with each step until the chamber was quiet once more. Christopher laid back, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since the crash, he didn't feel lost, just uncertain, and strangely not alone. Christopher awoke with the faint scent of burning spices still clinging to the back of his throat. The warmth of the alcove had lulled him into a surprisingly deep sleep, but the questions circling his mind had returned the moment his eyes opened. He sat up slowly, the moss beneath him cool and springy, and stared at the dim flame hovering above the chamber's center. The temple was quiet, unnervingly so, and without the usual hum of a ship's systems or the distant thrum of alien wildlife, the silence pressed down around him. He didn't belong here, he knew that, and yet something about the space felt patient, as if waiting for him to make his next move. He rose, stretching out the stiffness in his shoulders, then stepped back into the corridor leading to the archives. He had questions Mona hadn't answered, maybe wouldn't answer unless he pushed. The temple, despite its mysticism and archaic grandeur, had clues buried inside it. He could feel it, not just spiritual markings and chants, but history, something real, something scientific. The etchings of the other human figure haunted him. If someone like him had come before and been absorbed into this belief system, then the cycle might be older than they thought, and he wasn't ready to be swallowed by it. The archive chamber was empty when he returned. The glowing pool still pulsed gently, casting ripples of red light across the walls. He stepped closer to the carved images again. This time he activated the compact scanner strapped to his belt, half smashed in the crash but still functional. The device hummed and flickered as it analyzed the pigment embedded in the stone. The results blinked onto the small display, less than 80 years old. Synthetic mineral composition, human in origin. His stomach twisted slightly. There was no way this artwork had naturally emerged here. Someone human had been here before him, and not that long ago, possibly even during his lifetime. He scanned the other carvings, older, worn by time, made of native compounds. They depicted similar figures, beast women in various forms, some clearly Mona's ancestors, others more animalistic, evolving through the centuries, but always paired with a figure marked by something alien, sometimes bearing flames, other times holding stars, but increasingly human in shape as the timeline progressed. At the center of the far wall, directly above the pool, was a massive etching, the Divine Union. A beast woman and a male figure cloaked in fire, standing atop a burning world. Christopher stared at it, frowning. Was it metaphor, a premonition, a fabricated belief designed to bind generations to a cycle of ritual submission? Or was there something real about the way the mist had reacted to his presence? His arrival, the altars, even Mona's response, none of it added up neatly. He didn't believe in gods, but he did believe in patterns, and this one was beginning to unsettle him. "I see you couldn't sleep long." Mona's voice came from the corridor, calm and measured. He turned, tucking the scanner away, not bothering to hide what he'd been doing. "I found traces of another human, one who came before me." She stepped into the room with the same quiet grace, her veil redraped, her ceremonial beads clicking softly as she moved. "Yes." He arrived during the Ashen cycle when the moons bled fire. His name was Darren. He stayed for one season before he vanished into the mists. "And you let him leave?" Christopher asked, arms crossed. "We did not. The mists consumed him. He tried to escape before the rites concluded. The flame rejected him." He narrowed his eyes, or maybe he just realized what this place was and bolted. "You ever think maybe your flame isn't divine, just another piece of tech left behind by something older than both our species?" She stepped closer, gaze unwavering. "What we call divine, you call anomalous, but the result is the same. Power, when misunderstood, becomes worship. The flame responds to intention. It reacts not only to touch, but to desire. You felt it, the way the mist thinned around you, the way the altars flared." "I felt a coincidence," he said sharply, though his voice lacked confidence. "Correlation, not causation." "You do not have to believe in the god," she replied. "Only in the bond between us." He blinked. "There is no bond." "You've known me for less than a day." "And yet," she said quietly, stepping so close he could feel the warmth of her body through the thin veil between them, "your sense still marks the chamber." He backed off before the space between them ignited something worse. Doubt, frustration, desire. Whatever it was, he wasn't letting it cloud his judgment. "I need access to your temple's deeper systems. Anything you use for record-keeping, storage, transmission. If I can trace Darren's path, maybe I can figure out how he got here, where he went, and how to reverse whatever locked the mist down. You wish to repeat his failure. I want to understand it." Mona studied him for a long moment, then gestured for him to follow. "Very well, but the deeper chambers are not protected by belief. Only firewalkers may pass. I will vouch for you, but once you cross the flame threshold, you cannot turn back." They walked in silence through a side passage, the temperature gradually rising. The walls became smoother, metallic instead of stone, etched with sigils and ancient circuitry. Christopher recognized some of the patterns, symmetrical arrays common to pre-fall relic sites, usually assumed to be leftovers from lost alien civilizations. Here, they were integrated seamlessly into the sacred design. The cult hadn't built this, they inherited it. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, sealed by a circular pattern that glowed faintly in response to Mona's touch. She turned to him. "You must place your hand on the central flame sigil. If your intentions are accepted, it will open. And if not, then it will burn away everything false." He grimaced, but stepped forward. The sigil flared as he pressed his palm against it. For a moment, heat surged through his skin, searing bright, unbearable, and then it subsided like a breath released. The doors parted. Inside was a room unlike the others, cool, silent, and full of floating orbs of light, rotating displays of data and fragments of languages half-translated. A console pulsed at the center. Mona remained at the entrance. "This is what remains of the original sanctum. Before we knew what it was, before we gave it names, you will find what you seek here. But I warn you, not all knowledge brings peace." Christopher stepped into the room slowly, pulse quickening, eyes locked on the rotating records. Somewhere in here was the truth. About Darren. About the mist. Maybe about himself. But as the doors closed behind him with a whisper of flame, he realized something else. He no longer knew if he wanted to leave Nithra 9, not just because of the mystery, but because of her. The chamber swallowed him whole, not just with its vastness, but with the weight of preserved time. The glow from the floating orbs gave everything an amber hue, like walking through a memory sealed in glass. Christopher moved slowly, reverently, though he didn't consider himself the reverent type. There was an undeniable pressure in the air here, not from heat or mist, but from meaning. These weren't just relics or scraps of alien technology. This was a command center, or what was left of one. The core console pulsed with light, responding faintly to his proximity. Lines of fragmented code and ancient pictograph shimmered across the central screen in layers, slowly translating into readable strings as his suit's algorithms strained to keep up. He tapped one of the floating data threads and watched as it unfolded into a three-dimensional diagram, an orbiting map of this moon and at least 3 others in the local system. Pulse lines traced past entries and exits, some human, most not. One signal matched the energy signature of his own crash, while another older pinged with a faint echo, Darren. He followed it, dragging the map wider, tracing his predecessor's movements. It showed a rapid descent, a crash like his own, but the trail ended not at the temple but somewhere beneath it. In a sub-level, the surface structures didn't acknowledge. A forgotten level, a sealed level. Christopher narrowed his eyes, adjusting the filters on the map, layering thermal signatures and radiation traces until the outline of a buried space appeared, like the ghost of a city beneath the soil. Not a shrine, not a sanctum, a vault, possibly a ship or a lab, maybe both. Something big, something powerful, and whatever it was, the temple had been built to top it, either unknowingly or by design. Either way, it wasn't just a place of worship anymore. It was a mask. He stepped back from the console, heart beating fast, half from the thrill of discovery, half from dread. Whatever lay below had drawn Darren in and never let him out. That wasn't faith. That was a trap, and he was standing right above it. The chamber doors hissed open behind him, and Mona entered without a word. Her presence, so often commanding in ritual spaces, felt quieter here. She looked around the room like someone revisiting the ruins of a childhood home, part awe, part sorrow. "You knew this was here," he said, not accusatory, but certain. "Yes," she answered, "though not in the way you think. My role as High Flame is passed through blood and memory. Each priestess is given fragments of the ancient knowledge, but not the whole, to protect us, or so we believed." "This isn't a temple," Christopher said. "It's a control room. The mist, the flame, the symbols, they're connected to a machine buried underneath this place. A machine your people have been treating like a deity for centuries." Perhaps all gods are machines, she said softly. Or perhaps machines are just the bones of sleeping gods. He turned toward her, brows furrowed. You don't actually believe that? I believe what I feel, she replied, stepping closer. And I feel that the moment you touched that door, everything in this place shifted. The mist thinned, the light changed. The others felt it too, though they'll call it divine resonance. You call it energy fluctuation. Either way, the result is the same. You belong here. I'm not Darren, he said, more to himself than her. No, she agreed. He came with fear. You came with curiosity. That's why the door accepted you. He looked back at the glowing map, the buried structure beneath them, pooling like a heartbeat. I need to see what's down there. If Darren tried to get in and failed, maybe I can finish what he started. Maybe I can find the truth, shut this thing down, or wake it up. Either way, I'll know. She was quiet for a long time. Then quietly she said, There is a way down, a passage only the high flame and her chosen may enter, but the right to open it is not symbolic. It's a trial, physical, mental, and spiritual, if you will. Let me guess, he said, half smirking. Fire, pain, and hallucinations. She tilted her head slightly, and clarity if you survive. Christopher nodded, not because he wanted to, but because the alternative sitting in the dark, waiting for answers to fall from the sky, was no longer acceptable. Then let's begin. Mona led him through another passage, deeper still, where the air grew hotter with each step. The walls shimmered with bioluminescent script, flowing like ink across stone, telling stories he couldn't read but somehow felt in his bones. The path ended at a platform overlooking a river of molten light, plasma, not lava, channeled through a series of glowing veins across the temple's foundation. A narrow bridge spanned the flow, and beyond it, a wall of pure flame danced in a perfect vertical line, unmoving, unburning. This is the threshold, Mona said. You will walk through it. If your heart is false, the flame will consume you. If it is true, it will reveal what lies below. He stared at the flame, then at her. And how many have made it through? She didn't answer. Christopher exhaled slowly, then removed the upper layers of his gear, keeping only the essentials. He stepped onto the bridge. Each step made his skin prickle, the heat radiating upward in waves. He remembered something his father once said during a storm-chasing expedition. Sometimes you don't wait for proof. You walk into the thunder and pray the lightning misses. At the center of the bridge he paused, then walked straight into the flame. There was no pain, not at first, only light, endless blinding light, then pressure like diving into a sun, then sound, not external but within him, whispers, screams, memories that weren't his, visions of creatures, of stars dying and being born, of temples rising, of a woman with opal fur watching from a distance as a man disintegrated into mist. Darren. He saw it, his struggle, his failure, his mistake. Darren had tried to claim the temple, not earn it. He treated it like a puzzle, not a pact, and the system rejected him, not because he wasn't divine, but because he didn't respect the bond. Christopher fell forward out of the light, gasping as cool stone greeted his skin. The flame had vanished behind him, replaced by a glowing passage leading downward into the unknown. Mona stood at the edge, her eyes wide, not with surprise but something deeper. You came back, she whispered. He rose unsteadily, still shaking, vision blurry. I saw him. I saw what he did wrong. She nodded. Then you are ready. He didn't know what lay below, but for the first time since landing on this forsaken moon, he wasn't walking in circles. He was moving forward, toward answers, toward the truth. And with Mona beside him, no longer a priestess, but something far more real, far more uncertain, he took the first step into the heart of the flame. The descent into the lower passage was steep and uneven, carved not by tools but by time. The walls shimmered with threads of ancient circuitry running just beneath the surface, pooling with a soft amber light that followed Christopher and Mona as they moved. The silence was thicker here, broken only by the sound of their boots against the stone and the occasional hum from the glowing pathways that slithered across the ground like veins. It didn't feel like walking through a temple anymore. It felt like crawling through the circulatory system of something alive, something ancient that had not yet decided whether to trust them. Christopher said nothing at first. The weight of what he'd seen in the flame pressed heavily on his mind. Visions not just of Darren's failure, but of something deeper, darker. He'd glimpsed fragments of a war, one not between armies, but between belief and understanding. A conflict fought in silence through rituals and whispers. Mona had watched all of it unfold in that vision, her face carved into memory like a statue on the edge of collapse. She wasn't just a priestess clinging to the faith of her people. She was a woman caught between reverence and rebellion. It struck him harder than he'd expected. "You didn't tell me you saw Darren die," he finally said, voice low. She didn't turn to look at him. "I didn't know if you'd believe me." "I saw him," Christopher muttered. "He didn't fall. He dissolved. The system rejected him, burned him out from the inside like he didn't belong. He walked in like he could master it, like he could override it." Mona stopped at a stone ledge overlooking a vast chasm that opened beneath the temple, a hidden void filled with towering crystal structures, their tips glowing faintly beneath layers of mist. Thin bridges of light stretched between platforms, connecting what looked like archives, energy cores, and remnants of a control nexus. At the very center was a suspended spire, hovering in place with no visible support, wrapped in bands of metal and encased in glowing glyphs. "That," she said quietly, "is the heart of the flame." Christopher approached the edge, staring down at the impossible structure. "What does it do?" "It chooses," Mona replied. "It connects all memory and will. It judges not through thought, but through harmony. If you lie to yourself, if you carry greed, pride, arrogance, it will know. It does not destroy to punish. It destroys to protect what remains." He nodded slowly. "And if I go down there and pass its judgment, then it will reveal what it has hidden since the first gods fell." He looked at her then, really looked. For all her poise, Mona's eyes carried exhaustion, years of balancing devotion and doubt, bound by duty and legacy. There was something soft there now, something unspoken that had begun to crack through the ritual mask she wore. He reached out without thinking and took her hand. "You're not just here for answers," he said. "You want freedom." She blinked, caught off guard. "I want my people to choose faith over fear. I want to know if we've been worshipping a lie or living inside a misunderstood truth, and I want to stop repeating the past." Christopher squeezed her hand once, then stepped onto the first bridge. The light solidified beneath his boot with a ripple, reacting to his presence, calibrating his balance. He moved carefully but confidently, each step illuminating more of the pathway until he reached the floating spire. A platform rose from beneath the chasm, forming a circular space just large enough for one person. He looked back at Mona, then forward toward the structure. He stepped onto it. The moment he did, the platform began to rise. The spire responded immediately. Glyphs lit up in cascading rings, the outer bands spinning slowly as the inner rings remained still. The air grew heavier, saturated with warmth and static. A pulse pushed through his chest, not physical, not pain, just a nudge like fingers tapping on his mind. The machine wasn't asking questions, it was searching. His name, his childhood, his failures, his ambitions, all of it surfaced at once. Memories flickered in front of his eyes, losing a research grant, saying goodbye to his dying mother, failing to connect with people, always observing, never belonging. His endless need to make sense of things that didn't care to explain themselves. And then Mona, her voice, her scent, her restraint, her strength, her trembling resolve. The glyph slowed, the spire hummed. Christopher stepped forward and placed both palms on its surface. It didn't burn, it didn't resist. Instead, the warmth intensified until it surrounded him entirely, lifting his senses into something beyond thought. He saw the truth. This wasn't a god. It was a sentient archive, an interface left behind by an ancient civilization, built to preserve knowledge and regulate energy. The mist, a containment field; the flame, a regulator for psychic interfaces; the worship. A side effect, misinterpretation turned into generations of devotion. The machine hadn't asked for prayers. It had asked for harmony, balance between emotion and logic, passion and restraint. Mona had guided him to it, not because she believed he was divine, but because she hoped he was honest. As he released the spire, the glyphs pulsed once more and projected a small sphere of light into his hands. It hovered, weightless, warm. Information compacted, a key. The platform began to lower. When he reached the landing, Mona was waiting. Her expression didn't need words. She could see the answer in his eyes. "I was right," he said softly. "It's not a god, but it is watching, and it's been waiting for someone who could understand it and respect it." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, but her grip on his hand tightened. "What now?" "We show them," he said. "Not just the truth, the choice." Together they walked back across the bridge, the mist parting for them with quiet ease. There was no ritual waiting above, no fanfare, just the path ahead, and the realization that neither of them had to walk it alone. And somewhere between the fire and the silence, something new had been born. Not a prophecy, not a command, just a connection forged in truth and lit by something dangerously close to love. The temple above did not roar in approval when Christopher and Mona returned. There were no chants, no booming voices declaring divine affirmation. The silence was heavier than before, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Word had spread. The priestesses lined the outer edges of the great sanctum in rows, their veils lowered, their expressions guarded but alert. The mist had thinned further, now revealing every etched symbol on the floor, every curve of the plasmalite stone. The atmosphere had changed, less sacred, more expectant. They all knew something had shifted. The rituals felt smaller now, like shadows cast on a wall after someone had torn open the sky. Mona led him through the central aisle, her shoulders squared, her gaze unflinching. Christopher stayed at her side, silent, watching how they looked at her, not just as a leader, but now as a potential traitor to the old order. The key in his palm, still glowing faintly, pulsed with warmth. He had uploaded some of its contents to his suit, ancient schematics, detailed logs, explanations of the systems beneath the temple, and left the rest untouched, a gesture of trust. This wasn't about proving he was right. It was about showing them they had been more than followers all along. They reached the central dais where the eldest priestesses waited. They wore robes so heavy with ceremonial beads they barely moved, their eyes hidden behind opaque flame glass. The High Council. Mona bowed her head slightly, and Christopher mirrored her movement, not out of reverence but out of respect for the weight of history they were about to challenge. "I have returned," Mona said, her voice calm but resonant. "The flame has opened, the mist has parted, the one we received has passed the trial and returned with the truth." The lead elder, her voice dry and measured, spoke without turning her head. "And what does this truth demand, High Flame?" Christopher stepped forward, raising the glowing sphere between his hands. "That your god isn't a god, it's a machine. A sentient archive created by beings long before either of our people stood upright. It was meant to guide, to preserve, to protect, not to rule. The rituals you follow, their maintenance protocols, the visions, interface echoes, you've been worshipping a user manual." The chamber did not erupt. It didn't need to. The tension was sharp enough to slice through the mist that still clung to the corners of the sanctum. One of the younger priestesses in the outer ring shifted slightly, breaking the perfect symmetry of the gathering. That subtle movement spoke louder than any gasp. Another elder raised her head. "And what would you have us do, outsider? Throw away our traditions because a foreigner walked into a sacred place and survived it?" "No," Mona said quickly, stepping between them. "We don't throw anything away, but we stop treating ignorance as holy. We stop fearing questions. The flame chose him not because he was perfect, but because he was honest. He didn't try to control it. He listened. We've lost that. The lead elder's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them. You speak of blasphemy as if it were medicine. I speak of clarity, Mona said. For generations we've bound ourselves to fire and mist, but those who tried to understand were silenced. That ends now. Let the people know what the flame truly is, and let them choose. Faith should never fear knowledge. Christopher lowered the sphere, placing it gently on the altar stone. It hovered an inch above the surface, pooling steadily like a heartbeat. Everything you need is in here. The temple's origins, the history of the sentient network you've been living on, even what happened to the last human who came here. I'm not here to lead anyone. I just want to leave knowing I didn't let another cycle of blind worship kill someone else. The elders didn't speak for a long time. Mona remained still, her hands open, her expression unwavering. The silence stretched heavy, uncertain. Then one priestess, young, valorous, and standing apart from the others, stepped forward. She looked at Mona, then at Christopher, and bowed deeply. I wish to see, she said. Another followed, then two more. The symmetry shattered, replaced by a slow ripple of motion as lines broke and bodies shifted. A few elders remained unmoved, locked in place, unwilling to break from the stories they had spent their lives protecting. But change had already begun. After the congregation slowly dispersed, Mona led Christopher back through the quieter chambers of the temple. The corridors that once hummed with controlled ritual now felt unsealed, exposed to possibility. They walked in silence until they reached the lava pools beneath the sanctum, where the floor radiated warmth and the firelight played across the stone like liquid sunlight. She sat down at the edge of the rock platform, her long tail curling beside her. Christopher lowered himself next to her, the heat from the molten river soaking into his skin. For a while they just breathed. You were right, he said. Your people didn't need a god, they needed a voice. Mona exhaled, her eyes focused on the dancing light, and I needed someone who wasn't afraid to tell me the truth. He glanced sideways at her, studying the way the soft glow played across her fur, making it shimmer with that strange opalescent beauty that still caught him off guard. You never flinched, not once when you saw the truth. You just accepted it. No, she said with a soft smile. I faced it. That's different. Acceptance comes after you fought the part of yourself that wants to stay blind. He nodded, leaning back on his elbows. So what happens now? A reformation? A civil war? Mona didn't answer right away. Then she turned to him, her voice lower, more personal. Now we rest, for one night. No prophecy, no flame, just us. Her hand found his claws gentle against his skin. He didn't pull away. He didn't want to. She shifted slightly closer, her gaze meeting his. The flame chose you because you didn't ask to be chosen because you were real, and because, she hesitated, voice dipping, you see me, not just the priestess, not just the symbol me. Christopher reached up, brushing a strand of her veil from her cheek. I saw you the moment you told me I didn't have to be divine, just honest. She leaned in slowly, and he didn't stop her. Their lips met, tentative at first, uncertain, then growing surier, deeper. The heat from the lava was nothing compared to the warmth blooming between them, slow and steady, uncoiled from something that had been winding for days. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't a rite. It was a choice. Theirs. When they finally pulled apart, Mona rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that, wrapped in the soft breath of firelight and silence, knowing that tomorrow would bring hard decisions and harder conversations. But tonight was theirs, free of prophecy, unburdened by fate. And for the first time since the crash, Christopher felt like he wasn't just surviving this world, he was becoming part of it. Morning didn't come in beams of sunlight on Nithra 9. It arrived with the soft hiss of shifting mist and the gradual brightening of the temple's plasma veins, as if the walls themselves stirred from slumber. Christopher awoke, still wrapped in the fatting warmth of the lava chamber, the glow of molten rock casting soft shadows along Mona's resting form beside him. Her breathing was slow and deep, her opal-toned fur rising and falling in a rhythm that calmed something restless inside him. He didn't speak. He didn't move for several minutes, just watched the way she looked when she wasn't carrying the weight of a world built on misinterpretation. Without the veil, without the rituals, she was simply herself, and that made her all the more real. But peace, as always, was temporary. A sharp tone echoed through the corridors, metallic and grating, a high-pitched signal, nothing like the soft bells used for ritual summoning. Mona's eyes snapped open, already alert. She sat upright and scanned the chamber, her hand going to the curved blade she kept hidden beneath her ceremonial drapes. "That's not from us," she said, voice low and grim. Christopher stood, retrieving his suit's interface unit. The readout confirmed it. A foreign signal was pinging the temple's outermost perimeter. He checked its origin twice before muttering a curse under his breath. "It's a scan," he said. "A ship's orbital pulse, human tech." Mona was already on her feet. "Your people." "No," he said. "Mine wouldn't just scan, they'd land. This is stealth mapping. Military pattern could be scavengers, could be worse." She didn't ask for further explanation. Instead, she led him quickly through a side corridor that connected to the upper temple balconies. From there, they reached the outermost terrace, where the mist had fully parted, exposing the jagged peaks of obsidian rock that bordered the sacred grounds. Above, a faint shimmer broke the otherwise opaque sky, a cloaked ship mid-orbit barely visible to the naked eye. Christopher's breath caught. "That's a black signal scout, corporate or mercenary. They've been tracking high-energy anomalies. My crash probably tripped a beacon." "And now they found the flame," Mona said quietly. He nodded, jaw clenched. "If they get inside, they'll strip it, take the archive, tear through the temple, and call it a salvage operation." Mona's face remained still, but her tail flicked behind her in agitation. "The elders will think it's another trial. They won't see the threat until it's inside their walls." "Then we warned them," he said. Mona led him back into the sanctum, where the atmosphere had already shifted. The same young priestesses who had stepped forward the day before were organizing others into quiet groups. Words like flamestorm and incumbing flamewalkers passed between them. The myth had already begun reshaping the truth. Christopher could see it in their eyes, the need to make sense of danger by fitting it into old prophecy. The High Council stood at the central altar, their faces unreadable. The lead elder looked down at them as they approached, her voice brittle. "You've disturbed the balance, High Flame. Now the sky sends challengers." "These are not gods," Mona said calmly. "They are thieves. They will not walk through fire. They will come with guns and take what they want. If we don't act now, we lose everything." Another elder spoke defiant. "You said faith should not fear knowledge, yet you ask us to panic." "I ask you to prepare," Mona snapped. "Because this isn't a vision, it's happening now. Look around you. Your flame has chosen, your mist has lifted. You asked for proof. Now you face the consequence of being seen." Christopher stepped forward and tapped his interface, projecting a small hologram of the ship's outline above them. "They'll drop a team within the hour. Standard loadout is 6 personnel, 2 scouts, 2 engineers, 1 asset handler, 1 enforcer. Don't let the small crew fool you. They're designed to strip an ancient structure bare in under 2 days, and if you resist, they call in the next ship." Silence rippled through the sanctum. The younger priestesses looked to Mona, not the council. The lines of authority were changing minute by minute. "We defend the heart," Mona said, steady now. "Not because we worship it, but because it belongs to no one. It is not a trophy. It is not a relic. It is knowledge, and knowledge should be guarded." The elders didn't stop her this time. Maybe they knew their grip had slipped, or maybe they simply didn't know what to do when myth met orbit. Preparations began immediately. The priestesses who had trained in flame dances adapted their rituals into defensive patterns, placing signal disruptors around the temple perimeter. Mona opened the temple's old weapon vault, more ceremonial than practical, but useful in the right hands. Christopher repurposed energy projectors from the plasma altars, reconfiguring them to emit short-range bursts strong enough to disable low-altitude hovercrafts. It wasn't a military defense, but it was enough to make any invader slow down. Hours passed quickly. The ship above stayed silent, cloaked, waiting. Christopher hated that. It meant they weren't in a rush. It meant they were watching, calculating. That night, he found Mona standing at the edge of the sanctum once again, watching the stars. She didn't look afraid, just focused. "You're not leading them with fear," he said, stepping up beside her. "You're leading them with truth." She glanced at him, and still, part of them wants to believe this is fate. "Maybe it is," he said, "but that doesn't mean it's not ours to shape." She didn't respond immediately, but her hand found his again. No ceremony this time, no pretense, just connection. "You should know something," she said. "If this goes wrong, if they breach the sanctum and you survive, take the archive and run. Don't look back." He shook his head. "No, we're past that. I'm not leaving you behind. Not now." Mona smiled, a quiet flicker of something fierce in her expression. "Then we stand together." As they returned to the temple's inner ring, surrounded by glowing plasma, sacred mist, and the distant hum of an approaching threat, Christopher realized something deep and unsettling. He didn't want to leave Nithra 9 anymore, not because of the mystery, not because of the temple, but because of the woman who stood beside him, unmasked, unafraid, and stronger than any myth ever written. The first warning came in the form of silence, not the spiritual quiet of the sanctum or the natural hush of Nithra 9 mislaced landscape, but a mechanical deadness, a stilling of the plasma lines that had pulsed steadily since Christopher's arrival. It was like the temple itself held its breath. The glowing orbs dimmed fractionally, and every priestess turned their gaze skyward. They didn't need an announcement. The ship had begun its descent. Christopher stood at the base of the temple's steps, moaning beside him, both watching the atmospheric distortion twist in the sky. The black signal scout pierced the veil slowly, silently, until the shimmer broke apart into visible lines, sleek, predatory, and far too familiar. The craft didn't roar. It didn't fire. It settled into the soil like a spider, limbs unfolding with precise efficiency. Then came the ramp, extending with a faint hiss, and 6 figures emerged, encased in matte armor, faces obscured behind adaptive visors. Each held equipment suited for different roles. Data extractors, ground-penetrating scanners, pulse rifles, not a word spoken between them. Christopher activated the dampeners he'd rigged near the plasma altars. A low thrum vibrated beneath his feet, followed by a flicker of static around the temple's edges as the jamming field came online. The scout's tech would be partially blind now, navigation skewed, comms limited. It wouldn't stop them, but it would delay them. Every second mattered. Mona stepped forward before he could stop her, her veil discarded, her presence commanding. She raised a single hand, open, not threatening. "You walk on sacred ground," she called out, voice echoing cleanly through the thin air. "You are not summoned. Turn back." The leader of the group, taller, bulkier, armored in a darker shade, tilted his head, then stepped forward slowly. His voice came through a speaker filter, mechanical and cold. Beacon triggered, high energy site confirmed. "This zone is unclaimed. We're here for recovery and extraction of anomalous tech." Mona didn't flinch. "You misunderstand what you're walking into. That anomaly is sentient. It is not your salvage." "It isn't yours either," the man said flatly. "And the moment your mist field drops, orbital ownership reverts to the highest bidder. You don't have jurisdiction here. We do." Christopher joined her then, stepping into full view. "That's a mistake," he said. "I know who you are. You're running dark market pulls for architect or a private buyer. You don't want a war. You want a clean harvest. The man's visor reflected him like a mirror. You're the crash signal biologist, civilian status. That means you don't get a say. Then maybe you'd rather hear from the system you're about to poke, Christopher replied, raising the glowing key sphere. This archive's alive, sentient, and it's aware you're here. That gave them pause. Not long, but enough for their enforcer, massive, with enhanced limb servos, to take a half step forward. Christopher held his ground. You try to breach the sanctum. It will respond. Not with prayer, with defense mechanisms even I don't fully understand. The team exchanged glances. Christopher didn't wait. He gestured subtly to Mona, and within seconds the outer perimeter flared. Flame lines, rooted through the ceremonial pools, burst into towering spirals of light, forming a ring that separated the temple from the landing site. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. We are not helpless. The scouts raised their weapons slightly. The lead gave a curtain nod. Proceed with Phase 2. That was the moment diplomacy ended. The enforcers surged forward first, leaping through the flame barrier which parted unnaturally, shaped by the temple's sentient systems. But Christopher had expected the aggression. He triggered the first trap, a refocused plasma beam that arched through the air and caught the enforcer mid-leap, sending him crashing sideways with a hiss of steam and cracking armor. It didn't kill him, but it shattered the illusion of invincibility. The rest of the team scattered, two attempting to flank left through the obsidian trench, one trying to cut up the ridge, another staying behind to feed tactical data into a wrist console. Mona's priestesses moved with trained precision, not as soldiers, but as guardians of something deeply personal. Their weapons were primitive by comparison, but the temple gave them the edge. The plasma altars redirected, pooling with energy they'd only recently learned to wield, not worshipped, but harnessed. Christopher ducked as a pulse round shot past him and ricocheted off the temple wall, searing a chunk from the stone. He moved fast, drawing one of the modified signal disruptors from his belt and hurling it toward the closest engineer. It landed with a thud, flaring in a burst of static that disrupted the HUD displays of two scouts who stumbled as their visors flashed white. One was tackled by a priestess before he could recover, her blade cutting through his shoulder plate with a decisive arc. They weren't killing unless they had to, but the message was clear. This place would not be stripped without resistance. From the upper platform, Mona stood tall, tail raised, horns gleaming. She called to the heart of the flame in a voice that rang like a command across time itself. The response was immediate. The mist surged forward, no longer gentle. It wrapped around the invaders, not suffocating them but isolating them, cutting their visual fields, throwing off their balance, interfering with their proximity sensors. The sanctuary had woken, and it was angry. Christopher scrambled toward the altar, where the central control relay was beginning to pulse erratically. The archive was reacting emotionally, not calculated defense, but something closer to panic. He placed both hands on the pedestal, syncing with it again. "We're not the threat," he said. "Let me guide you, show restraint, defend, but don't destroy." The system responded, the glow softening slightly, stabilizing its output. The mist receded enough for the priestesses to regroup, and within minutes, 3 of the 6 intruders were incapacitated. 1 wounded, 2 others isolated at the perimeter with no way forward. The leader, realizing the operation was spiraling out of control, activated a recall beacon on his wrist. A red pulse lit the sky signal for extraction. Christopher turned to Mona, chest heaving. "They're pulling out." "Not in triumph," she said. "In failure." They watched as the scout ship disengaged from the surface, lifting into the mist and vanishing behind a cloak. The threat was over for now. The sanctum was quiet again, the fire lines dimmed, the archive resumed its normal pulse. Christopher looked around at the scorched stones, the wounded priestesses, the faces hardened by experience. "We held them off," he said, "but they'll tell someone more will come." Mona nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "Then next time we won't just protect, we'll be ready to explain. This was never about war, It was about proving we're worth hearing. He looked at her, at the woman who had been his captor, his guide, his partner in discovery. And what about us? She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, placing her palm against his chest, her claws gentle, her voice like a breath of flame. We stand as one. Together, they turned toward the temple, damaged, sacred, and now undeniably alive with purpose. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. After the invaders retreated, the temple didn't relax. It adjusted. The mist no longer hovered idly in the corners of the sanctum. Now it moved with purpose, flowing gently through the hallways like a silent guardian, pulsing in rhythm with the heart of the flame buried below. The archive had accepted its awakening. The priestesses had seen the truth with their own eyes, sacred ground that bled light and resisted intrusion, not with divine fire, but with ancient intelligence and instinctive defense systems calibrated for survival, not ceremony. And still, no one walked away from their faith. The difference was subtle but vital. Belief had shifted from obedience to understanding. They no longer feared the flame. They worked with it. Christopher spent the next 2 days moving between the archive chamber and the upper sanctum, assisting Mona in organizing the integration of new knowledge. The glowing orb he'd retrieved, the key, had unlocked a cascade of buried data that reshaped everything they thought they knew. Not just about the temple, but about the entire moon. The structures dotting the misty landscape weren't remnants of an alien religion. They were conduits in a massive network, a planetary nervous system built to preserve cultural records, evolutionary data, and, in rare cases, interspecies behavioral trials. Nithra 9 had once been a galactic observatory, not a military post or colony, but a vault for sentient experience, and now it had awoken to find itself surrounded by a faith it hadn't asked for, and a human who'd arrived by accident, and yet managed to pass its final gate. Mona remained the axis around which the temple turned. She moved through her people with a balance of certainty and humility, no longer reciting rites from inherited memory, but speaking with the clarity of someone who'd stepped through fire and returned with answers. Some elders remained uneasy, unwilling to release their grip on the old ways, but they no longer had the influence to suppress what had been revealed. The younger priestesses listened to Mona with open minds and guarded hearts, their loyalty not to prophecy, but to the truth she had helped them uncover. By the 3rd day, Christopher stood beneath the open sky outside the sanctum, staring at the patch of earth where the scout ship had scorched its mark. He traced the black in lines with the toe of his boot, thoughts circling. He hadn't forgotten what the leader had said. This moon was unclaimed. To corporations, that meant it was open season. If Arctech hadn't flagged it, someone else would. Word would spread. More ships would come. This place couldn't hide forever. Mona approached from behind, her presence quiet as always, her silhouette striking against the haze. Her translucent robes had been replaced with something simpler, a sleeveless tunic stitched from woven crystal thread, beads wrapped around her horns in soft spirals. She looked less like a priestess now, and more like what she truly was, a protector with no illusion of divinity. "They'll come again," Christopher said without turning. "Not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they'll come, and next time they won't send a scout team, they'll send a ship built for breaking worlds." Mona stepped beside him, her gaze falling on the same scorched earth. "Then we'll be ready." "I've already drafted a transmission," he continued. "Encrypted. My suits, comms are working again. I can bounce it through the relay in my wreck. If I route it through old channels, I can get it to a preservationist org, one of the cultural sanctity networks. If we register this place as a protected site through the right back channels, maybe, just maybe, they'll leave it alone." She didn't speak for a while. "Then will you go with it?" He finally turned to her. "I don't know." The air thickened with meaning. Neither of them blinked. She didn't ask him to stay. He didn't ask her to follow him. The bond between them wasn't fragile, but it was new, raw, and rooted in the crucible of their shared experience. Every decision felt heavier now, not because of fear, but because of everything they stood to lose if they chose wrong. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm. "If I stay, I make this place a target. If I go, I might be able to buy you time, maybe even protection." She looked up at him, the firelight from the distant sanctum reflecting in her eyes. "And what do you want, Christopher? Not for the temple, not for the galaxy, for you." He swallowed, jaw tightening. "I want this. I want you. But I also want to make sure you're safe." "You think you have to choose?" she asked softly. "I think I always have to," he answered. She touched his face. Then, fingers warm, steady, claws retracted, just skin against skin. "You're not a god, Christopher, but you've already changed our future. That's more than most who walk through our flame. Whatever you choose next, I'll trust it." He leaned into her touch, then pulled her into an embrace. There was no passion in it, not in that moment, just understanding, shared breath. The pause before decisions became real. Later that night, he stood inside the archive chamber again, watching the light spiral slowly around the heart. The sentient system recognized him now, trusted him, not as a prophet, but as a participant. He uploaded the encryption capsule and coded a narrowband transmission. Once the signal went live, he wouldn't be able to take it back. He stood with his hand, hovering over the relay button for a long time, long enough that the mist coiled around his legs like a living question. Finally, he pressed send. Mona was waiting when he emerged. She didn't ask what he'd done. He didn't explain. "I set the message to activate in a week," he said. "Enough time for you to prepare or to stop it if that's what you decide." She nodded once. "Then you'll stay. I'm not leaving until we know what this place really is. All of it. The network, the memory strands, the old stations buried in the mist. If this is going to be protected, we need to know what we're defending." "And after that?" she asked. He looked at her, smiled slightly. "Then maybe I'll ask if there's room for a permanent outsider in your little flame cult." She arched a brow. "We don't call it a cult anymore." He grinned. "Good. Alien Archive girlfriend sounds way better in a data log anyway." She laughed, low and unexpected. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh like that, unguarded, unfiltered. He wanted to hear it again. They stood together in the temple's entrance as the first night breeze swept over the ridge. There would be more visitors, more trials, but they would face it together. The beast woman and the human, the flame and the logic, not as savior and worshipper, not as leader and follower, just as two souls who had found each other in the last place either of them had expected, and that Christopher thought might be the most divine thing of all. 3 weeks passed, long enough for the mist to settle back into a gentle rhythm, and for the temple to breathe again as a living structure rather than a battlefield. In that time, Christopher didn't just remain, he became a fixture. What had once been a crash survivor wandering through sacred halls turned into something deeper, more deliberate. He walked among the priestesses not as an outsider, but as an equal, maybe not in title, but in trust. The glowing orb, once clutched as a key to mystery, now floated in the archive chamber in full sync with the heart. The system had stabilized. Its presence no longer felt like a looming riddle, but like a quiet guardian, pooling with memory, responding not to commands but cooperation. And for the first time in its long existence, it wasn't simply being interpreted, it was being heard. Christopher spent his days between restoration efforts and guided tour, not for tourists, but for the temple's own people. Mona had reorganized the sanctum's purpose. Gone were the rigid, inherited rituals built on misunderstood signs. In their place were studies, language reconstruction projects, artifact indexing, and open discussions. The priestesses, who had once bowed in rhythm to sacred chants, now stood confidently in front of projection orbs, learning how to read data lines, how to trace the connections between their traditions and the technology that had always been there. And no one was forced to abandon faith. They were simply given the choice to see it through new eyes. On the surface, the temple remained visually the same. Its spiraling stone paths, flame-lit halls, and gold-threaded murals still marked it as something deeply old. But the energy had shifted. Fear no longer held it together. Truth did. And beneath it all, as the archive slowly revealed itself, station by station, buried node by buried node, it became clear that Nithra 9 wasn't just a relic. It was one of the last surviving pieces of a vanished civilization that had tried to preserve the universe's wisdom before chaos took it. And it had chosen this moon, and the people on it, to protect that legacy. Mona changed too. She kept the title of High Flame, but the veil was gone for good. Her wardrobe remained ceremonial only in shape, light armor now threaded with bands of both crystal and conductive mesh, functional and symbolic. Her claws were no longer symbols of divine strength, but tools she used to repair conduits and activate dormant subnodes. The tail, that once held only a flickering orb of fire, now doubled as a conduit interface, fine-tuned to stabilize local systems. And when she walked through the temple, those who bowed did so out of choice, not conditioning. The reverence was no longer demanded, it was earned. And at her side, almost always, was Christopher. Not because anyone expected it, not because of prophecy, but because neither of them wanted to walk this new path without the other. Their bond hadn't faded with familiarity, it had deepened. There was something different in the way she looked at him now when they argued over whether to initiate a full diagnostic sweep or wait until the weather grid aligned. There was something in the way he touched her back absent-mindedly during strategy meetings or handed her a fresh data pad just before she asked for one. Love wasn't a grand ritual. It wasn't a declaration against fur, breath against breath. And when they held each other in the stillness, unshakable rhythm of two people who had been forged in fire together and come out stronger, they made love beneath the mist. Not in secret, but in peace, curled together in the crystal cavern chamber they'd converted into shared quarters. No prophecies echoed around them, no sacred symbols burned overhead, just the soft pulse of the heart's light and the comfort of skin against fur, breath against breath. And when they held each other in the stillness afterward, they didn't speak about destiny or divinity. They simply existed, and it was enough. The day the protection broadcast reached the Interstellar Preservation Network, an official relay was sent back. Approval had been granted. Nithra 9 was now listed in the Galactic Cultural Record as a Level 1 legacy world. Extraction and interference from any corporate or military body would now trigger full sanctions. Enforcement ships were already patrolling the Outer Rim, and monitoring satellites had been deployed. Christopher read the final line of the report aloud to Mona in their quarters, voice steady. Status, archives safeguarded, indigenous culture recognized as legitimate stewards, system integrity remained stable, human presence acknowledged, no further interference authorized. He looked up from the message. Mona was watching him from across the room, one brow raised. "Does this mean you're out of a job?" He laughed softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It means I finally finished something without it blowing up in my face." She crossed the distance between them, arms folding around his waist, tail curling lightly against no longer choking the atmosphere. The stars blinked back at him like familiar. He pulled her close, forehead resting against hers. "As long as the position includes you, I'll take it." The kiss was quiet, slow, without urgency. They had time now, all the time they wanted. Later that night, Christopher stepped outside the temple alone, looking up at the stars. The sky was clearer now than when he'd first arrived. The mist no longer choking the atmosphere. The stars blinked back at him like familiar faces. Somewhere out there, the world he'd left behind still turned, still moved forward, but he no longer felt tethered to it. His purpose wasn't in some distant lab or buried in research reports. It was here with her, on a world that once mistook silence for divinity, but had learned to listen again. He didn't need a legacy. He didn't need recognition. He had a home now, one born not from fate, but from choice. Mona joined him, silent, slipping her hand into his. They stood there until the first blue light of the dawn mist glimmered on the horizon, and the temple behind them hummed, not in worship, but in welcome. And that was how it ended, not with war, not with miracles, not with loss, but with understanding, love, and the quiet promise that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side together.